I think cultural value is something that this whole conference is about. So not easy to answer in a really short way, but just to say that cultural value, I think, stretches across all the spheres of the society. So it would include economy or financial, it would include social, and it would include very personal kind of values. So all of these should be included when one talks about cultural value. Extrinsic values are those, as I understand it, that are more objective. So these can be things like the economic impact of a concert or a festival, where you can use market prices to measure what was the impact on the economy of that particular event. Intrinsic ones are much more personal. So these are the feelings that you have from going to a concert or to seeing some wonderful art or listening to music. It's that feeling of delight or happiness, or sometimes the function of culture is to make you feel uncomfortable. So you feel worried, or you feel that your ideas about the world have been changed or questioned in some way. And so I think the extrinsic ones are easier to measure, and that's why economists tend to focus on those. The intrinsic ones, very difficult to find some kind of way of aggregating them to express as a general feeling, because I think for everyone they are quite different. Well, I think this is very different for different countries. So for South Africa, where I come from, public funding does lead the way, especially in fields where there are lots of public good kind of spillovers. So things like heritage, museums, libraries, and so on. Private sector leads the way where there are more specialist interests. So for example, a jazz festival, then you would often find there would be a bank or another kind of private company that's funding that. And I think that's a good mix, because if you only have public funding, then only certain kind of things get funded, because it's always in line with what the government thinks should be provided for the country. Private funding gives an opportunity for other voices to be heard, because the private sector may fund some things that the government sector wouldn't like to go near. So it may be just something for a particular part of the population, but it may also be something that's quite risky or innovative, or that may cause offense. So I think that's also a function of art, is to make debate in the society, and I think that's where private sector comes in a lot. I think sustainable development by itself is quite difficult to define, and culturally sustainable development, that's an even more difficult one. But I think that the two have to be connected. So for the sustainable development goals have to take into account the cultural context in which this is all happening. So you can have something which is economically sustainable but not culturally sustainable, or you might have something that is best practice in the market but which is totally rejected because of the culture of the people. And so from a multicultural society like the one I come from, there are really different ideas about what is valuable and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of how you make your living, how you develop, what is important in life, the kind of relationships that you would have with your children, your parents, your grandparents, all those kinds of things. So the danger from a developing country perspective is that we take models of sustainable development from other countries, developed countries, and we say, okay, here's a nice model, we just put it in place right here in South Africa, and it should work perfectly because it worked so well in Spain or the UK or Canada or wherever. And of course it doesn't work. And I think quite often it's because they haven't taken into account the cultural context. So for me, culturally sustainable development means taking into account the value systems and the culture of the economy or the society where these things are being put in place. Well-being is much more than just having enough food or healthcare or access to education. I think well-being is a much broader kind of concept. And it has to take into account individual personal feelings. So, of course, if we think of the hierarchy of needs, people who don't have access to good water or healthcare or food wouldn't be thinking about other things very much. But as soon as you get past that, then suddenly it becomes really important. How you are feeling depends on your ideas about freedom and your ideas about self-expression and identity. And these are important at every layer of society, just past that basic needs being satisfied. So for me, well-being is just automatically connected with culture, because the way that somebody from South Africa defines well-being, and even within different groups in South Africa, might be totally different from how someone in Europe or the US or Australia defines well-being. So what's important is just really quite separate. And so that's why you also need to take into account the cultural context. Cultural industries as a sector, as understanding, is quite a new thing. So they've often been, they've always been there, of course, but never seen as one connected sector. So we've always looked at, say, the movie industry or architects or advertising, but as separate things. And the problem is that they're still quite dispersed in terms of policies. So in South Africa, the Department of Trade and Industry does all the film subsidies, but the Department of Arts and Culture does all the museums and like professional associations. So I think understanding the sector as a coherent whole that has similar, if not the same, but similar kinds of ideas and goals is a really big step in the right direction in terms of helping them to reach their potential and acknowledging their importance in the society. So the cultural and creative industries are shown in many countries. We don't have the data yet for South Africa, but indications are that they grow faster than the rest of the economy. So they're part of this new service sector, creation and innovation being really important drivers of economic growth. And so I think that this is a big potential contributor to economic growth overall. Well, you're asking an economist, right? So I think there's a lot of resistance from artists themselves or practitioners, shall we say, to this idea that economics can have something important to say or useful to say about the cultural creative process. And I think it's because it's a misunderstanding that economics means money. So if you are an economist, you only care about money or finances or market prices and those kinds of things you can measure easily. But that's not really true. I mean, economics is about everything. It's about the choices that you make in your everyday life, the choices that government has to make, well-being, as you've already mentioned, sustainable development, livelihoods, and all of those things fit under economics. So I think economics can have quite a lot to say to the arts and culture sector, helping to, especially to express the kinds of values that they produce in a way that policymakers and funders will understand. So a lot of the work that I do is to use economic theory to talk about different kinds of value associated with the cultural and creative industries, and then saying to artists, well, could this framework be useful for you to talk to the funders and the communities that you work in and the government policymakers. So in a way, I think we can be a bridge between all the different groups in society to express and to, in some cases, measure cultural value. In cultural economics? Yeah. Okay. So if it was me, let me answer it that way, I think I would be really interested in this idea of the cultural and creative industries as drivers of economic growth and development. So not just growth, but also development. And the big gap is not so much on the consumption side, so what do the users do and buy and so on, but on the production side. So how does this happen? How do the cultural and creative industries actually work? And there's a lot of case study, anecdotal evidence out there about the precariat, so people who are highly educated in, say, the film sector, one of the most studied sectors, where you have short-term jobs and you move from one contract to the other. But I think there's lots that we don't know about what's also happening in other sectors, like how does the craft sector work? These seem to be small, stable businesses that exist, over time. How does the informal sector work? And so I think this is an opportunity where the developing countries can have an advantage, because for us, the norm is the informal sector. So the minority of people are employed full-time with a pension plan and kind of, permanent job. Most people are working in the informal sector in a whole bunch of different activities or production ways. And so I think that if I was going to choose a direction in cultural economics now, I think I would go in for the production side of the cultural and creative industries and the differences between developed country context and developing country. I think that there are different spheres of influence. So if I publish an article in an academic journal, I don't think there's all that much chance that some policymaker will read that, which is why I think it's so important to have a kind of parallel communication system, like a blog or a website or a short policy brief or something like that. And I think those, they do notice. So very recently, the Department of Arts and Culture in South Africa has established the Cultural Observatori, which is a research hub which is funded by government on the cultural and creative industries. And so I'm part of that, and the job there is to produce policy relevant research. So that means we do, when we talk or publish something or do some research, then there is a direct channel to the Department of Arts and Culture, and some of that will filter up, I think, into how decisions are made and what policies are put in place. So yes, you have to work a bit harder than just writing your paper and sending it to the journal, but I think there's lots of opportunities for that kind of conversations and knowledge sharing to happen.